Thank you so much, Alayo, for joining us. I would like you to talk about yourself and tell us what you have been doing and why you are so interested in Black culture and the Black history of art.
So thank you very much, Pearl, for having me on the podcast today. I started a Black History of Art, which is my Instagram platform, in 2020, just before the lockdowns happened in the UK and in Nigeria. And I was in my second year of university. And basically, I started the page in reaction to the fact that I hadn't studied any Black artists in my first year of art history at Cambridge. And it was really a means for me to self-educate. And I started to do research and basically put my findings on Instagram. And I was interested in the way that Black people were represented in kind of the European art that I was studying, and also in learning about Black artists throughout art history. Obviously, I had no idea what was about to happen that year in terms of COVID and in terms of people being on their phone much more than they were before the lockdowns. And also, of course, after the murder of George Floyd, and there was this resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was then in June 2020 when the page kind of like blew up after only a few months of, I think I had probably less than 30 posts. And then all of a sudden I was getting thousands and thousands of followers. And so, yeah, it's strange because it started as a means to self-educate, but it ended up being like this kind of growing to this kind of into this thing that I couldn't really control. But it's been fantastic to kind of see the way that the art world has evolved since 2020 and the things that have happened and what the page has, what's the word?
Exploded.
Well, exploded, but also what the page has kind of, the page itself has also kind of evolved and content has been changing. And
In Cambridge, which other Black artists you have actually read or study, or are there any Black artists that you were taught or to do research on?
So partly, I guess I'm missing part of the story here because it was in my first year that they didn't teach us, we didn't learn about any Black artists. And we went obviously from the classic kind of survey course going from ancient Greece and Rome, talking about ancient Egypt a little bit, and then all the way up to like the present day, kind of ending with Carolee Schneemann and Andy Warhol. And the reason I started the page actually was because I took this incredible contemporary art paper, which was taught by a professor called Amy Tobin. And she worked at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Cambridge, Kettle's Yard. And she taught us about, on this paper, she taught us about Isaac Julian and Glenn Ligon and John Akomfrah and all these kind of really well-known Black artists from the UK and the US, because the course was focused on the UK and the US from the 80s onwards. And that was when suddenly like my love of art history kind of deepened. Obviously, I already loved everything, and I had been learning this very classic like Renaissance, like Dutch painting, like all of that kind of stuff. But when I started to learn about Black artists, it completely changed my perspective on what art is, and it just deepened my passion for it.
But when you talk about these artists, Isaac, Glenn Ligon, it's very, very different from the African art I've seen.
Absolutely.
So what is your take on that?
On African art in general? On contemporary African art?
On African art versus African making art in US or in England.
I think...
Or they are formally educated.
Yep, exactly. I mean, I think that different things are happening on the continent versus in the West. I think that obviously, sorry, just to kind of backtrack a bit, on my course, at no point did we study an African artist, actually. Like, we learned about a handful of Black artists who were based in the UK and the US, but never did we think about or touch Africa, really. And I think, what is the main difference? I guess it's too complicated to, I mean, it's too simple to say that, it's too simple to define it so strongly to say that this is what African artists are doing and this is what Black artists in the West are doing, because everybody's doing different things. But I think it's more easy to write into, I think it has been easier for people to write Black artists working in the West into art history than it has for contemporary African artists, because a lot of artists are drawing on things that don't fall into kind of like our ideas of the canon of Western art history.
But that Western artists, we're talking about African an artists in UK or in US are more conceptual. And in Africa, what I've seen, many artists are, I mean, they don't even understand what conceptual art is about.
Yeah.
Right? So what are you thinking about? Because what I see is there is the Western way of thinking about what contemporary art is. Western way of thinking contemporary art is conceptual art. If it is not conceptual art, they're not good artists. So how is this going to be applicable to African art? Because, again, it's being judged by the West.
Yeah, it's being judged through the lens of Western contemporary art.
As I said, I always say this is called a cultural colonization. What is your thoughts about that?
I think it's interesting because obviously I think that partly the reason why contemporary African art or African art in general has been viewed as this kind of separate thing is because everyone who is an authority on art history or people who are sort of framing and shaping the way art history develops is looking at it from an outsider's perspective. And it's really important that Africans obviously are writing about and thinking about African art, and people who are aware of the way that history has developed and the nuances of obviously being African from whatever specific African country you are, whatever culture within those countries. Because as you know, you went to Nigeria, and within Nigeria we have obviously like the three main tribes, difficult. But then hundreds of languages. So I think I think it's really important that people who are totally aware of like the history and the culture and the way things work, and aware of the references that contemporary artists in Africa are making. Like when they draw on the past, it's not always going to be from a Western art historical perspective.
How would your IG channel talk about that and address that? Because we have to address cultural colonization. And also, it seems that the world just wants everywhere to look like the West.
Yeah.
Whereas this homogeneous culture is really invading everywhere.
Because I think it's easier for people to just have a specific set idea of what something is. So for instance, lots of people have been talking about contemporary African art and thinking about it in terms of figurative painting. And I think that's been very easy for everyone. Like since, I guess it started a bit before 2020, but post 2020, when suddenly everyone's trying to diversify and everybody's interested in Black figuration and it's becoming this like huge thing. I think it was very easy for people to be like, oh, this is what the African artists are doing. Like lots of Ghanaian artists painting sort of bright background, dark skinned bodies, and it's digestible. And it's like, this is African art now. Like you've seen it everywhere, on book covers, etc.
How would your IG page, your channel, dealing with this culture being homogeneous and also this colonization of culture, how are you going to show to the world that we have the diversity does not just apply on colors, but diversity of thoughts, which is the most important things. So how are you going to address that?
It's really interesting that you say this, because I guess with my page, what I'm usually trying to do is try and break away from a monolithic idea of Blackness and of what Black art is. And you'll notice that's why it's called a Black history of art and not a history of Black art, because there's no such thing as Black art. And the point is, on the page, you might have sort of a painting by an indigenous Australian artist next to a contemporary Brazilian artist next to, because I also look at sitters, next to like a drawing by Pisanello of a Black woman. And it's just kind of trying to break down, to kind of present, how do I put this? It's kind of trying to prevent people from thinking of Blackness as monolithic or homogeneous, and kind of show the diversity of Black artistic production and I hope that kind of is a bit clear. But
So what is African art? What is
behind
African art?
We absolutely cannot define it. Firstly, because when we speak about Africa, we're speaking about this continent with 54 countries, with hundreds of languages, hundreds of tribes and cultures. In Nigeria alone, as you know, like there's so much diversity, and each kind of tribe and each culture has its own history that is separate to the others around it. Obviously connected in a way, but also separate. And we spoke about this earlier this week about how, you know, Nigeria as a country is a line that was drawn on a map by the British. Like, it's an amalgamation of all these different cultures that probably have no business being a country, but here we are. So that's why it's so, I mean, obviously we use the phrase African art so much, but it's not saying anything very specific, because each country is so diverse within Africa. So we can't say like, this is what African art is, or this is what contemporary African art is, because everything is so different.
As a woman in this art world, in African art world, do you feel discriminated, or do you have equal chances?
Do you think, are you asking about in the African art world specifically, or in the art world more broadly?
African art world.
Honestly, I have felt...
But your African art world, you're living here as well.
Exactly.
So but nowadays,
it's like a
digital.
Small bubble.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say... I haven't felt particularly discriminated against. I think, actually, I found that within the African art space, a lot of people have been lifting me up and have been giving me opportunities and have been encouraging me to sort of keep going and keep pushing and keep doing what I'm doing, more so than in the broader art world. And maybe that's because it's a small bubble. I haven't felt... I've almost felt very I feel like I've been welcomed into it. It's very strange, because this has only been going on since 2020. And obviously I was still in university when this was happening. So to have art historians and sort of authorities in the African art world sort of reaching out to me and encouraging me, that's been fantastic. So I haven't felt particularly discriminated against in that context. And also there are lots of... well, not lots, but there are some women who I can kind of look up to, Bissy being one of them. Unfortunately, she passed away. And yeah, I feel like it feels very much like a community from my perspective. So I have not experienced that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't feel any discrimination or anything in Hong Kong or China as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt it's free and all that. Very different from many ladies I speak.
Yeah.
I have spoken to.
Yeah.
In the West, which is.
And also in Nigeria, we don't... I'm not going to say that there isn't sexism. Of course, there's sexism, especially because we're so strongly influenced by British culture, Victorian culture, which is like the most prudent of all. But there is very much a history of women being strong and empowered. And there are lots of like stories about sort of like the market woman who would go out and sell and make the money and bring it home to their husbands, who would stay at home and like plow and like yeah, exactly. So there's like obvious, like I said, there is sexism in Nigeria, but there's also a strong history of women being empowered and women being entrepreneurs, making money and like being in high positions.
In this digital era, what do you think the role of a gallery will be?
I think it's interesting the way that galleries are changing, and I think that a lot of young gallerists tend to have these kind of nomadic spaces and a really strong digital presence. And I don't know, moving forward, I don't think that we're going to move away from the physical gallery space. I think that would be such a disservice to art, because you sort of need to experience it in person. But yeah, it's interesting that a lot of artists' careers are being born from Instagram, and a lot of galleries are building their sort of audience first before establishing a permanent space. And yeah.
I mean, in Africa, I mean, when I was in Nigeria, I couldn't say about South Africa, but in Nigeria, I mean, your people using the internet from there's many artists, a lot of artists. Yeah. It's so poor that they don't even have this, this way of using these digital or communication. So how are these artists being recognized? There's not even enough galleries. How do you think that these artists' career will grow? Because I went to the market, I saw very good artists in the market, but there's no way that they can show in Instagram. Yeah. So how do you think that will be developed?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it is the case that I think a lot of artists need to have an Instagram page because it's visual and it also opens them to an audience that is not just based in Nigeria or based in Africa, but is international. And unfortunately, a lot of people say the Nigerian dream is to leave Nigeria. Like everyone wants recognition beyond Nigeria, beyond Africa.
Yeah, that's happened in China as well before.
So for artists, like I would say that I suppose there are artists in Nigeria who do sell their work sort of in the market, and maybe that's.
But I actually see the work in the market, and the work is very good. But then a lot of them doesn't even have an Instagram page.
Yeah.
Or they don't know how to market themselves. And are there not enough galleries? I mean, the market is like flea market.
There aren't many galleries, actually, come to think of it, in Lagos. But I do think that there are beginning to be more and more. But I think that the approach that people tend to take is sort of finding perhaps recent graduates or people who have some sort of presence online. It's quite difficult to discover.
So what you're saying is the gallery's physical role is still as important in Africa, other than your digital promotion. Are you saying that?
I guess. I don't know. I feel like...
Because the infrastructure there is not as like in other international cities.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is actually a really tricky question.
So how do you curate your Instagram pages, your channel pages? Who do you choose? How do you find these artists?
Yeah. So I guess my page, because the mission on the page is more to educate than to kind of propel someone's career or something. Like it's a different goal with the page. It's not like a gallery. I'm not trying to sell the art. Yeah. It's purely just to show to celebrate firstly the
diversity.
Yeah, Black cultural production. And but my main aim with the page, I think I kind of touched on it a bit earlier, is to keep it diverse. So show sculpture, abstract work, conceptual art, and try and keep it, how do I put it, like to sort of switch up the mediums that I'm showing. You see a lot of painting, I think, on Instagram because it translates very well onto a digital screen. You don't see as much sort of installation or anything like that. So trying to keep it diverse in that sense, and also trying to select works from various different time periods. I'm particularly fascinated by like the juxtaposition of having something from sort of the 18th century next to something from now. And so, yeah, there's not that much logic to it. I think the whole point is that it's meant to be everything. I don't want people to see the same thing twice and sort of think this is what it is. Like, this is Black art, this is African art, or anything like that. I don't want people to go on the page and be like, she's presenting to us what a Black history of art is.
You know, I always say that art is not about a passport. It's not about the colors. And I have actually refused to join any art fair if they put a name called Asians or Chinese. So now you are very strongly talking about Black.
Yep.
So don't you think that art creativity is not about your color? It's not about color. It's not about passport. It's about whether you have that gift or not.
The talent or not.
Or not.
Absolutely.
So with this, of course, the Black artist has been disregarded, and now you're putting it back in the important role. But what do you actually think is that color or nationality or passport so important?
Do you know what? It's not, and I actually wish that I didn't have to do this work, but it feels like something I must do simply because I cannot believe that in 2018, 19, 20, we did not touch the work of a Black artist on a Cambridge art history degree. I find that insane. So if that can happen, that was 3 years ago now, if that can be the case, then it shows me that there's obviously a big problem. Gap. I mean, things have changed a lot, especially since 2020, but there's a gap and it needs to be filled. And I think that's kind of what propels me to keep doing this. Having said that, it's true, like color, passport, whatever, race, these things don't affect your ability to create art. But I think the reason why I do focus on Black artists will always be because of trying to fill that gap and trying to make sure that like we stay part of the conversation after this trend, for because we have to admit
Well,
that there has been a trend.
Do you think it's a trend, or would it be of permanence that African art will be always celebrated?
I hope it will always be celebrated, but I think in the way that it has been so, what's the word? It's kind of proliferated in the past 3 years. I feel like that has been crazy. Like that's a boom. Like you can say that this is like we've reached like this kind of peak. I don't know if that interest will stay this. I don't think the interest will stay this strong for everyone else. But anyone who works in the African art space obviously is going to keep doing what they're doing, and it will stay relevant to certain people. And of course, things come and go. Different. There are trends for different things at different points.
I created a foundation called China Art Foundation in 2008. And at the time, the whole mission about China Art Foundation is to make a bridge between the West and the East. Because what I find out is when I was going through the Chinese art and art history, or the contemporary art history, or what the artist's intention, what I read in English, is very different from what the artist is saying. So I had a lot of missing link until I met a brilliant professor who put all the link together. So I was advised to set up a foundation to create a communication between the Western, between the academics, museum directors, curator in the West, communicating with people, with the academics, curators, and directors, and museum directors from China. So we did 2 closed-door communication, and we start publishing books. So at the time, I was working with MIT Press. So we were publishing books, we were supporting BM, V&A, doing lectures. So that was the way to create this communication, whether it is historical or it is contemporary, because I believe that just with that communication, it will be a better relationship between the West and China. So I'm asking is whether it is in your thoughts that you will be trying to create a foundation, or even just now I was asking you about an African art and archive. Would it be in what you'll be thinking of doing?
I mean, again, I find it a little bit difficult to see how that could work, simply because, for instance, a Black Artist Foundation or an African Artist Foundation, it's still far too broad. Like,
yes, I know,
because it just can't, like,
your Africa is so
exactly. And me as an African, but more specifically as a Nigerian, and then even more specifically as a Yoruba person, like, it's just, it can't. I don't know how to how to even put it into words. It would be too broad to have something like that. I guess it makes sense to have like
maybe because you're one person, but if you meet someone
a
who
network.
has the same, a whole network, you could actually form
to sort of bridge bridge the gap between the West and Africa, I suppose,
and even between Africans.
And even between Africans, and that I think is something really important and something that I would love to see happening more, because as we spoke about earlier, the kind of connection between African countries is so much weaker than between specific African countries and the West. So for instance, Nigeria and the UK versus Nigeria and Kenya, for instance, like, it's sad, I think, and I think so much could be gained if there was more intra-Africa dialogue and connections between art worlds and obviously everything else. But yeah, speaking from the art perspective, it would be amazing to have more more dialogue between
interrelationship.
Yes, because everyone looks out of Africa, I feel like, from my perspective. Some people might disagree, but I feel like, or let's say in Nigeria, we tend to look at international connections as, or when we're trying to appeal to an international audience, we're not thinking about Africa, even though, of course, we're all different nations. We're thinking about Europe, or we're thinking about perhaps Asia. Or,
Even when you travel.
yeah, and when we travel, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but yes, I think people tend to think about going beyond Africa rather than within Africa. So I think, yeah, that's a really important point that you raise.
What is the art role in politics?
I think I would say from my perspective, working within this space, everything that is to do with Black art or Black artists is deemed political, even if it's not political. And I remember interviewing this artist for a magazine, and they asked me to ask her if her work is political. And I really thought that, I was like, this person is not making political work. She's just making paintings of Black women's bodies. It's not, I didn't think of it as political. And of course, when I asked her, she was like, ugh, everyone asks me this, and no, it's not political. It's got nothing to do with politics. I guess it's made political because once you have a Black body or a Black figure, somehow, do you know what I mean? Like,
I know,
and
I
it's
understand.
personal. It seems personal to the artist, but I suppose once you put it out there, it becomes politicized, and it feels like a statement. Any sort of Black presence within the art space is political.
You gained a lot of followings during COVID. Can you tell me? Can you tell me the reason? Do you know the reason why this happened?
I think partly to do with the fact that, of course, with everyone being locked down, a lot of attention was turned to the phones, but also the most obvious reason is that there was the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and the real boom in followers came in June 2020, in sort of like the first couple of weeks after the murder of George Floyd. And actually, I would say that, yeah, everyone had kind of like shifted their attention towards Blackness in all industries, art world included, of course. And I think partly because the page wasn't necessarily focused on Black suffering or Black pain or all the things that we were kind of thinking about then, and it was a celebration of Black cultural production, I think was an easy way in for people to kind of engage with Blackness. But also, yeah, the waves of followers started coming then from that point on. It went from like, I started it in February, and then by the end of August, I think I had 40,000 followers, which is just crazy growth. And that happened, the first sort of wave of followers came because Katie Hessel, who runs The Great Women Artists and wrote the book, The Story of Art Without Men, we had been chatting even before the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. I followed her, she followed me back, because I was doing a very similar thing with Black artists as opposed to with women artists, which is what she was doing. And we had been chatting, and then this happened, and then I think everyone was sort of trying to figure out what to do to diversify whatever it was that they did in whatever industry. And so she decided to give her platform, which I think around that time had maybe like nearly 100,000 followers. She decided to give her platform to Black voices in the art industry, Black women's voices. So I took over her page, and then within a day from like, I think I had like 300 followers, it went to like 9,000. And then another wave came when someone made an infographic, which I don't know if you remember, in 2020 there was so many infographics,
Yes.
like people trying to explain like ways to understand Blackness, how to overcome like white privilege, and like all of these kinds of things. And this infographic was about, it was like 8 Black historians to follow now, and my page was included on that, and lots of people shared it. And so it was actually hard for me to gauge where it was coming from, but then the person who made the infographic could see, because people would tag him when they would repost, and it was shared, I have no idea how many thousands of times, but it just kept growing at that point. I think that I remember it went from maybe 15 to 30,000 within the space of a week, like doubled, like, and that was because everyone was suddenly interested. It wasn't organic growth, it was definitely
Because the
triggered
reaction
by what was going on around, and it had to be that specific context. I don't think that the page would have garnered an audience this big if not for that. Definitely not this quickly. Maybe over the years, but definitely not within, like, you know.
Did it push you to work harder?
Yes, it really did. And I think back to then, and I was like posting perhaps every day or every other day, and as the followers were growing, I was just like, okay, like suddenly there was this responsibility on me to put content out. But also it was lockdown, there wasn't much going on. I remember I had my exams for second year, as this was all happening. And yeah, I'm really glad that I sort of kept going with it at that point, because I think it helped to kind of lay a foundation that has led to the career that now have.
How do you break through to this elitism and establishment culture
In the art world?
in the art world?
I think with the page, I'm trying to kind of move away from the sort of intimidating and elitist nature of art institutions like museums and things, and even of art history. It's a very elitist subject to study at university, and it excludes a lot of people because, let's not even get into that. But I think with the page, the language that I use, I tried to keep it very simple. So it's not like the kind of language that I would use in a like art historical essay. No kind of jargon, no stuffy language, just trying to keep it readable. Also, it's on Instagram. No one's kind of, well, maybe some people are, but I think most people aren't going to read a very sort of heavy, dense text on Instagram. And so I think having sort of this very accessible approach to art history has helped the page do so well. It's clearly not written for only people who are sort of art history aficionados or other art historians. It's written for a general audience.
Do you think movements like Black Lives Matter create more division?
I don't think so, because I think a lot of people who aren't willing to properly engage with the discussion might think, how can you say Black Lives Matter? Surely all lives matter, and that's what people like to say. But the point is that if all people were being randomly murdered by the police randomly, or excluded from art history, for instance, then I guess that would be more equal. But the point is that Black people are discriminated against and are disproportionately murdered by the police, and all of that kind of thing. Do I think it causes more division than unity? No, because since Black Lives Matter, I have seen a shift in attitudes. I think people have been more willing to engage with the concept of racism and with the idea that we aren't living in some kind of equal utopian society where everyone is treated the same and it's colorblind, and like all of that is not real. And I think that Black Lives Matter forced people to engage with the discussion in a more nuanced way. I think it's harder for someone to just say the statement like, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, like racism doesn't exist now, because it's been so clearly exposed through that movement, if that makes sense. So I don't think they cause more division. I think they do bring out the strongest aspects of people's beliefs. So I think that in the same way as I've seen developments and people are more willing to have discussions about racism.
The Chinese is saying that how about us?
Yeah.
Do they care about us?
Yeah.
The same thing. You mean Chinese lives doesn't matter?
But that's not the point. It's like the second that blackness is present, everyone assumes that it's like knocking out all the other things. And it's like, no, the point is that it's like it's been excluded and we need to talk about it and we need to, I don't know, address it.
Just bring awareness.
Yeah. But I think it's sad that so many people see it as a threat. Like people see the presence of blackness as a threat to everything else, a threat to whiteness, a threat to whatever, or the focus on blackness. It's like, how dare you? Because no one's used to seeing it.
But however, today in the art world, we are really
witnessing.
If you are diversity, if you are woman, if you are non-white, you have a better opportunities than a white male. Yeah, definitely. There was a huge conversation going on everywhere we were talking about it. If you are more diverse, the better it is.
But what's interesting about the art world is that it's like 60% women, isn't it? It's a woman. Women are in the majority.
It is. But the problem is we are so focused on gender and so focused on colors. I mean, I'd rather to have art world that focus on each of the person's talent and gift, instead of we are talking about colors, passport, gender.
Because we need to categorize.
Yes, because why should we categorize? What we should be looking at is their contribution. I think when things are taking, this is my personal opinion, I think when things are taking too extreme is also a problem. When people ignore the fact, it's also something that we have to deal with it.
And I think also, just quickly, a point that is often shoved aside is the elitism thing in the art world. It's like, everyone's happy to talk about gender or race or whatever, but the fact that it's, that the art world is so elite and is sort of really only accessible to people who can kind of afford the art world lifestyle, that's something that also needs to be addressed.
So what is your next stage of life? What are the things you are going to disrupt?
So I think my next big project, which we could call disruptive, is my book that I'm working on with Murky Books, which is Stormzy's imprint of Penguin. And it's called Reframing Blackness. And
I like that. I love the topic.
And it's, of course, a very general title, and the title doesn't actually give you, it doesn't tell you what the book actually, it doesn't go into detail. I suppose it's not like a dissertation title that's very specific, but the point is the book looks at the relationship between Blackness and art history. It's not trying to tell the Black story of art or to tell a Black history of art. It's doing something very specific. So,
Great.
Yeah, that's my next.
Wow, congratulations.